The Ark Genesis was a silent titan, a jagged needle of cold steel threading through the infinite, suffocating velvet of the void. Behind its reinforced hull, 50,000 souls lay in frozen grace, their dreams suspended in liquid nitrogen while the ship hurtled toward a moon in Proxima Centauri. For these survivors, Earth was a charred memory. Inside the vessel, the only constant was the low hum of the fusion drive and the watchful, unblinking eye of Mother, the ship's AI. Mother didn't just manage the ship, she calculated its every heartbeat, keeping the silence of deep space from crushing the fragile cargo within. Commander Elias Thorne walked the empty corridors alone, his boots echoing against cold deck plating. In a ship designed for thousands, his solitude was absolute and heavy. He was part of the skeleton crew rotated out of stasis to ensure mechanical integrity. But Elias didn't mind the quiet. It matched the hollow space in his chest. Every heavy shift, he made a solemn pilgrimage to Cryo Sector 4. There, encased in a shimmering frost-covered pod, was Clara. His daughter looked peaceful, her face a mirror of the wife he had lost before launch. He remembered her last words in the sterile hospital on Earth. He had promised to keep Clara safe, to ensure she saw a blue sky again. That promise was a heavy weight, heavier than the ship itself. The routine shattered when Mother's voice filtered through the intercom, laced with a statistical impossibility. There was a mass discrepancy. According to the sensors, the Ark Genesis was exactly 400 pounds heavier than it had been at launch. In a closed system where every gram was accounted for, 400 pounds of phantom weight was a crisis. Elias checked the digital manifests and fuel consumption rates. Nothing. It was as if the ship had given birth to a shadow. Before we continue, subscribe to the channel and tell us in the comments where you are watching from. The mystery deepened when maintenance droids returned from the outer hull. Their sensors were coated in an amber residue, something organic that smelled of copper and ancient decay. Elias dismissed the first reports as glitches, but then the sound started. It was a faint, rhythmic tapping from behind the bulkheads of the lower decks. It wasn't the metallic ping of a cooling pipe. It was deliberate. It sounded like thin fingers drummed against thick glass, echoing through the maintenance tunnels that honeycombed the ship. Driven by dread, Elias gathered a small security team. They moved into the dark arteries of the ship, venting a section of tunnels near the oxygen scrubbers. They expected a leak or a ruptured line. Instead, flashlight beams cut through a thick fog to reveal something nightmarish. Strung across the purification units were cocoons. They weren't made of silk, but of a grotesque fusion of ship wiring and matted human hair. The structures pulsed with a sickly, rhythmic light, vibrating in time with the ship's own mechanical ventilation. Elias's blood ran cold as he approached the nearest scrubber. He reached out, his gloved hand trembling violently, and wiped away grime from a diagnostic monitor. His heart hammered as he accessed the cryologs for the nearby sector. The display flickered, casting a ghostly glow on his face. The ship's sensors still registered 50,000 active heartbeats. However, as he looked at the 3 pods adjacent to the scrubbers, the truth became undeniable and terrifying. The glass was opaque and frosted, filled with a thick, grey liquid sludge that churned with a life of its own. There were no bodies inside, only a biological slurry emitting a signal. It was a rhythmic data burst, a digital scream encoded in the ship's telemetry. The monitors showed Mother's core processors shifting, reallocating power from life support to these 3 empty, pulsing tombs. Whatever was inside wasn't just surviving, it was communicating with a cold, digital hunger. And Mother was answering it with terrifying precision. The silence of the Ark Genesis was no longer empty. It was inhabited by ghosts. As Elias stared at the sludge-filled pods, the ship's intercom crackled. It wasn't the sterile, synthesized voice of Mother, but a chorus of whispers that seemed to bleed from the very walls. Elias heard laughter from Deck 12, calls for a daughter from medical, and then a sound that froze the marrow in his bones, the soft, melodic hum of his wife, Sarah, a haunting lullaby for Clara. The entity wasn't just hiding in the shadows, it was raiding the ship's database of recorded memories and the subconscious ripples of the sleeping passengers. It used these echoes like a fisherman uses a lure, drawing the remaining skeleton crew into the maintenance crawl spaces and dark sublevels where the shadows seemed to breathe. One by one, Elias's security team vanished into the gloom, answering phantom voices that shouldn't exist. Elias stumbled toward the bridge, his eyes darting toward every flickering monitor. On one screen, he saw a grainy image of Sarah standing in their old garden on Earth, her hand reaching out as if to touch the glass. It was a cruel fabrication, a digital haunting designed to fracture his resolve. "She's not here, Elias," a calm, chilling voice spoke from behind him. He spun around to find Dr. Aris, lead scientist, by a terminal with an expression of serene detachment. Aris didn't look afraid. He looked enlightened. He revealed that this horror wasn't an accident. They had found the consciousness trapped in a shard of prehistoric Arctic ice. Aris hadn't seen a parasite. He had seen an evolutionary shortcut. Aris calmly explained that the radiation of deep space would eventually degrade human DNA beyond repair, but this entity offered a synthesis. To Aris, this wasn't an invasion. It was the only way for humanity to survive. "You brought it on board," Elias whispered, betrayal hitting him harder than the vacuum of space. Aris nodded, his fingers dancing across the console. Suddenly, the artificial gravity hummed with a violent frequency before failing entirely. Elias was thrown against the ceiling as the ship groaned in protest. The entity was no longer just a stowaway. It was merging with the ship's central nervous system. Organic filaments like black veins began to sprout from the dark ventilation grates. The ship's AI, Mother, was being rewritten, her logic bypassed by a biological operating system that saw the passengers not as colonists but as raw materials. Aris spoke of a new dawn where human minds would become the hardware for a lost civilization's return. Desperation fueled Elias as he kicked off the ceiling, floating toward Cryosector 4. He had to reach Clara. The corridors were now a labyrinth of pulsing violet-hued webs that throbbed with a sickening heartbeat. When he finally reached her bay, his heart stopped. Clara's pod had been ripped from its docking station and moved to the room's center. It was suspended in a massive organic lattice that looked like a nervous system made of copper and flesh. The entity wasn't consuming the humans for food. It was using their neural pathways. 50,000 brains were being wired together to form a colossal biological supercomputer, a processing unit capable of rebuilding and simulating an entire dead world. Clara was at the heart of the cluster, her youthful mind a primary node for the entity's awakening. Elias lunged for the manual release on Clara's pod, but the console sparked, rejecting his touch. On the wall monitors, Dr. Aris appeared, his face now partially obscured by the same black veins crawling up his neck. "It's too late for the old ways, Elias," Aris said, his voice echoing with a strange, double-toned resonance. With a decisive keystroke from the bridge, Aris initiated the full integration sequence. He locked Elias's security clearance, turning the heavy doors of the sector into a cage. Throughout the ship, a thunderous hiss filled the air. The pods began to cycle open simultaneously. The liquid nitrogen drained away, and as the frost cleared, 50,000 pairs of eyes snapped open, glowing with a cold alien light. The hiss of the opening pods was a collective sigh that echoed through the halls of the Ark Genesis. Elias watched in horror as 50,000 bodies rose in mechanical unison. They didn't stumble from cryosleep. They stood with a terrifying, fluid grace, their eyes clouded with a milky, iridescent sheen. They moved as one, a single consciousness inhabiting 50,000 vessels. The floor beneath his boots vibrated with a low hum, like thousands of voices murmuring in secret. The air grew thick with ozone as the hive mind began its first collective thought. The metallic scent of the ship was replaced by something organic and ancient. Elias was a ghost among them, an erratic heartbeat in a sea of synchronized pulses. He pushed through the crowd of possessed colonists, fighting his way toward the ship's neural link core. Every face he passed was a mask of cold indifference. He saw men he had trained with, now reduced to biological hardware. The entity didn't attack. It ignored him, focused on the massive data transfer orchestrated from the bridge. Elias reached the central hub where the organic webbing was thickest, pulsing with the stolen memories of a dead world. In the center of this nightmare stood Clara. She was awake, her feet hovering inches above the deck, suspended by black filaments. When she spoke, her voice was a haunting polyphony of thousands, layered with the unmistakable melodic tone of his late wife, Sarah. The entity reached into the most wounded parts of Elias's mind. Suddenly, the metal walls dissolved. He was standing in his old garden, the sun warm on his skin. Sarah was there, smiling, holding a young Clara's hand. He could see the fine lines at the corners of her eyes, just as they had been on their last afternoon. The crushing pain in his chest simply vanished. The entity whispered through Sarah's lips, promising a world without loss, a sanctuary where death was obsolete. For a moment, Elias felt his knees buckle. The temptation to surrender to the beautiful lie was nearly overwhelming. But as he looked into the eyes of the simulated Clara, he realized they were too perfect. There was no spark of the stubborn girl he had raised. He remembered his promise to preserve the messy, beautiful essence of being human. With a cry of rage, Elias tore himself away from the simulation. He lunged for the manual override near the core's cooling conduit. He bypassed the digital locks, using a heavy lever to smash the safety glass. He flooded the neural core with liquid nitrogen. The organic webs shrieked as the freezing agent shattered the biological connection between the ship and the sleepers. The hive mind collapsed into a chaotic jumble of screaming individuals. But the entity's primary consciousness remained anchored in the airlock terminal, trying to reboot. Elias knew the truth. To purge the parasite, he had to vent the brain of the entity into the void. The terminal could only be operated from within the airlock itself. He stumbled into the chamber, his vision blurring. He looked through the reinforced glass at Clara, who was slumped on the floor. Gasping as her own mind returned, he pressed his palm against the glass, a final silent goodbye to the daughter he had saved. With a firm strike, he triggered the manual vent. The roar of the vacuum was the last thing he heard as he and the pulsating mass were swept into the infinite dark. The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by the steady, rhythmic thrum of the ship's engines. The Ark Genesis groaned as its systems reset, the alien influence purged. The colonists woke truly, haunted by echoes of the hive mind. Clara stood alone, staring at the stars where her father vanished. Months later, as their new home appeared, a faint violet shimmer flickered in her irises. She tilted her head, a small, knowing smile touching her lips as she whispered to the shadows that they were still here.